Okay, so second screencast video lecture on uh, Marx's concept of history as a product of class struggle. I'm simply going to read through a portion of Marxism 2, a narrative summary of Marxist concepts that is available to y'all on readings and miscellany if you want to go back and look through that. But I think it might help for me to actually read it out loud and maybe make a few comments as I'm reading. Okay, so Marx's concept of history is a product of class struggle. So when Marx looks back at the history of capitalist societies, he sees something on the order of a pattern. Now, there are long periods of immense productivity and stability, which is to say, a tremendous amount of surplus value or profit is produced for a sustained period of time. And there are also periods of crisis. And crisis generally occurs after immense amounts of value or economic wealth uh, fall into fewer and fewer hands, and the proletariat becomes more exploited and impoverished. Now, as a consequence of economic and political inequality, capitalism undermines, or as the case may be, destroys the stability of civil society. It creates unrest and produces a tremendous amount of suffering. So, in short, people begin to feel the pinch and indignity of the capitalists or the bourgeoisie's exploitation of their labor power and feel as though they're being treated not as human beings but as simple commodities that are feeding the machine of capitalism and generating tremendous amounts of wealth while they are getting less and less of their share of the value that they actually predominantly produce. Right? Remember, for Marx, it's very important to remember that the proletariat or the laboring classes, the majority of society, produce the vast majority of the value that is produced by the capitalist system. The problem is most of that value ends up in the hands of the ruling class in the form of surplus value or profits that they invest in the superstructure in order to maintain and reproduce their economic and political interests, which is say their power over the laboring classes. Okay, so as a consequence, people start thinking, organizing, and protesting the injustices of the capitalist system. They arrive at what Marx refers to as class consciousness. It's a really interesting and precious thing that can change history for the better. This thing called class consciousness is an awareness of um, the sheer power in numbers that the proletariat has, of the immense value that they collectively produce for the bourgeoisie, of how little they receive in return for their efforts, not to mention the awareness that the bourgeoisie cannot maintain their power if the proletariat refuses to work on their behalf. So, this class consciousness is what we call a game changer. It's a long, complicated, exciting, and inspiring story as to how the proletariat collectively unite to fight for better wages, voting rights, the right to organize and form unions, the right to protest unfair treatment, the right to be treated with dignity, etc. But the fact of the matter is that if we look over the history of capitalist societies over the past 2 centuries, the capitalist, again during times of crisis, is forced to concede the demands of the proletariat. Okay? And so crisis engenders a situation whereby the people start to see through ideology and think clearly, creatively, and rationally in their own independent terms, which is say independent of ideology, to move history in a more just and humane direction. And I just want to call your attention to a quote from a very, very famous essay by Karl Marx, and it's titled On the Jewish Question. And here he refers to this thing called rights, or this thing called freedom. And he says that this is something that is won through class conflict, right? Through organizing and banding together in solidarity to demand better treatment, better working conditions, a living wage, to be treated as a human being, not just to be treated as a commodity, which is to say as labor power. And so Marx says that the idea of the rights of man uh, was only discovered in the Christian world. Historically, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. He's referring to the 19th century, the 18th century, the Enlightenment period, where the idea of the rights of man first emerged, right? And his contention is the rights of man is a product of class struggle. And it came about in the last century. You remember, he's writing in the 19th century. He says it's not an innate idea, something that just sort of falls out of the sky, right? It's something that emerges through the course of history. It emerges as a consequence of class conflict and also class consciousness, for that matter. He says, on the contrary, it is acquired in a struggle against the historical conditions in which man or human beings have been educated up to the present time. The rights of man are not therefore a gift of nature, nor a legacy from past history, but the reward of a struggle against the accident of birth and against the privileges which history has hitherto transmitted from generation to generation. They are the results of culture, and only he can possess them who has merited and earned them. Okay, so where do rights come from? They come from conflict. They come from the emergence of class consciousness, of solidarity with others, right? Who unite in order to build a more just, humane, decent, and rational, which is sustainable civil society. And so I oftentimes refer to well, there's an advertisement right there. That we have to endure. We still live in the belly of the beast of capitalism, right? So we have to have advertisement. But we also have these things too. Capitalism also produces this. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And this is history in action here. And I encourage you to view this speech, this I Have a Dream speech, which is arguably a result of class conflict, and also class consciousness.
At this time, I have the honor to present to you the moral leader of our nation. I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin.
You can refer to that in your free time, if you wish. This would be an example of a great statement.
To join with you today
I forget the origins of this particular quote,
as the greatest demonstration
but I believe it's Abraham Lincoln who said, "The arc of history ultimately bends towards justice." And I think that's something on the order of a Marxist notion, that through class struggle, through class conflict, through the solidarity of like-minded people, that a more just, humane, and decent civilization can be built together.
who had been seared in the flames of
Yeah, I'll
withering
stop it right here.
injustice.